Richard Kensington is one of the most iconic symbols of success in the American business world. Coming from a difficult background, he rose to become a self-made billionaire with a vast fortune and power encompassing many fields. Determination, sharpness, and relentless ambition helped Richard build a powerful empire from scratch. In board meetings, his name is always a symbol of sharpness and formidable presence. Many people admire him, and some even fear his immense influence. However, behind that powerful exterior, what Richard cherished the most was not wealth or fame, but his only son, Dorian Kensington. From the moment Dorian was born, Richard devoted all his heart and love to his child. He not only built a business empire for himself, but also with the desire to leave Dorian a grand legacy. Richard carefully nurtured every step of his son's journey, from choosing the best educational environment, seeking out the finest teachers, to creating opportunities for Dorian to engage and learn in the business world. Richard expects Dorian to inherit and develop the empire he has painstakingly built, not only with talent, but also with core ethical values such as honesty, responsibility, and gratitude. However, things did not go as Richard expected. Over time, Dorian gradually changed. He became arrogant, indifferent, and disregarded the values his father had tried to impart. From a humble boy, Dorian turned into a selfish person, relying on the wealth that Richard had spent his whole life building. The luxury, comfort, and power caused Dorian to drift further away from reality, disregarding the efforts and values of those around him. Richard was heartbroken when he realized that everything he did to prepare his son had unintentionally caused Dorian to become a stranger to himself. That disappointment gradually became a constant worry in Richard's heart. Has he failed in raising his child? Has this enormous wealth spoiled Dorian? In the midst of the struggle, Richard realized there was only one way to find the answer. He had to challenge his son through his own actions. No scolding or advice could make Dorian change. Only the truth could do that. Richard decided to execute a bold plan, give up everything, leave behind the luxurious life to live like an ordinary person. He wanted to verify whether his son truly cared for him or was just clinging to the vast fortune. This is not only a challenge for Dorian, but also a test for Richard himself regarding his role as a father. Will Dorian recognize the true value of family affection and what his father has sacrificed? Or will he forever be lost in his own pride and selfishness? This journey is not only a challenge between a father and son, but also a quest to rediscover forgotten values. Richard Kensington was not born with a silver spoon in his mouth. Coming from a poor family, he had to do all sorts of manual labor to make a living. It was those years of hardship that forged a person full of resilience and extraordinary willpower. Richard possessed nothing but a strong desire to rise and a firm belief in his own abilities. With intelligence, business acumen, and tireless perseverance, Richard gradually built a powerful financial empire. Each investment decision and negotiation deal was carefully calculated by him, transforming the company from a small business into a globally renowned corporation. For Richard, the immense fortune he has built is not only the result of relentless effort, but also the greatest gift he wants to give to his son, Dorian. He did not simply work for himself. Every penny and every achievement were accumulated and built with the hope that Dorian would continue to develop this legacy, bringing fame to the Kensington name. As a devoted father, Richard provided Dorian with the best conditions for development. From a young age, Dorian was exposed to the highest quality education, from prestigious schools to specialized leadership training programs. Richard spared no effort in searching for the best teachers, arranging meetings with outstanding leaders for Dorian to learn from. Not stopping there, he also facilitated his son's exposure to various big and small business deals, honing his business acumen and preparing for the day Dorian would inherit the conglomerate. Richard always believed that with this foundation, Dorian would become an excellent leader, not only successfully running the company, but also preserving the ethical values he had built. He expects Dorian not only to be the heir to the fortune, but also to preserve and promote the family's core values: honesty, responsibility, and gratitude. However, as Dorian grew up, Richard began to notice the changes in his son. Dorian was no longer the humble, eager to learn young man he once was. He gradually became arrogant, looked down on the efforts of others, and took his family's wealth for granted. Dorian spends most of his time enjoying a lavish lifestyle with expensive supercars, extravagant parties, and superficial relationships. He showed indifference towards the business, disregarding the moral values and responsibilities that Richard had tried to impart. In important meetings, Dorian often arrives late or doesn't participate, making up various excuses to avoid work. Richard couldn't help but feel disappointed when he realized his son was gradually losing his way. He felt helpless when the values he tried to cultivate were not appreciated by Dorian. In Richard's heart, a fear arose. Could it be that the immense wealth and overly comfortable life had made his son selfish, irresponsible, and unable to appreciate core values? This disappointment grows day by day, weighing heavily on the heart of the father, who once believed that everything he did was for his child's future. Richard was not only saddened by Dorian's failure to meet business expectations, but also pained to see his son lose his character, live in a fantasy, and disregard his father's efforts. Richard began to question himself. Had he spoiled his son too much? Is providing Dorian with everything without any effort the biggest mistake of his life? Those questions constantly haunt Richard, making it impossible for him to find peace. From a proud father, Richard gradually became a man troubled and tormented by the fear of failing in his role as a father. No other way, he realized he had to find a different path, some method to make Dorian recognize the true value of life and the responsibility he had to bear. It was from that disappointment that Richard began to hatch a bold plan, a challenge not only to awaken Dorian, but also an opportunity for him to understand better the son he had loved wholeheartedly. Will Dorian realize his mistakes and change, or will he continue to sink deeper into the wrong path? Richard knew that it was time for him to take action. Long sleepless nights, Richard Kensington kept questioning himself. As a brilliant businessman, he always made the right decisions in business, but now he was at a loss in his role as a father. Richard couldn't stop thinking that perhaps he had failed in raising Dorian. He once believed that giving his son the best, from a prestigious education, a luxurious living environment, to favorable business opportunities, would help Dorian grow up and become a strong man. However, now, all Richard receives in return is indifference, irresponsibility, and a disappointingly arrogant attitude. The fear was growing within him. Richard feared that the very vast wealth and power he had built had inadvertently spoiled his son. Dorian had become accustomed to everything being served to him, not knowing how to appreciate the hard work, not understanding the value of effort. Richard was heartbroken to see his son not only losing moral values, but also drifting away from the family. After many days of reflection, Richard knew that advice and serious conversations no longer had any effect on Dorian. He understood that his son could only recognize his mistakes when faced with harsh reality. Therefore, Richard made a bold and unprecedented decision. He would give up everything, not just wealth or status, but the entire luxurious life and reputation he had painstakingly built. He believes that only when he disappears can Dorian confront the truth and reveal his true nature. Richard meticulously planned for this disappearance. He quietly arranged the business affairs, delegating everything to trusted partners without letting Dorian or anyone else suspect. One early morning, Richard packed his belongings, taking with him a small bag containing a few old clothes and some cash. Before leaving, he stood silently in front of the luxurious mansion, a symbol of many years of relentless effort. His gaze lingered on the family photos covered in the dust of time. Am I doing the right thing? He wondered, but then quickly suppressed the hesitation. He knew that this was something he had to do, not only to challenge Dorian, but also to rediscover himself. And then Richard left, leaving everything behind. Leaving behind the glamour of the upper class, Richard began his journey of living anonymously as an ordinary person. From luxurious apartments, he moved to impoverished neighborhoods, squeezing into the dark corners of the city. The expensive suits were replaced with old, wrinkled clothes. The shiny shoes are now worn and tattered after long days of wandering. Richard had to face the harsh life he had never experienced before. Long, cold nights at rest stops, meager meals from cheap diners, and the indifference and alienation from those around him. Every moment of experiencing a life of hardship made Richard more deeply aware of what he had once forgotten while immersed in wealth. Despite living in harsh circumstances, Richard did not forget his goal. He silently observed Dorian from afar, watching his son's life through the windows of luxurious restaurants, listening to the whispers about extravagant parties. Richard witnessed Dorian continuing to live lavishly, enjoying all the privileges of wealth without any concern for his father's sudden disappearance. Once, Richard stood quietly in front of an upscale restaurant where Dorian often frequented. From a distance, he saw his son walk in, laughing and chatting happily with his friends. The pain pierced Richard's chest. Dorian never sought me out. Not a bit of concern. The son's coldness and indifference were like a knife stabbing straight into the father's heart. Richard couldn't understand how Dorian could live so nonchalantly when his only father had disappeared. Dorian's indifference had far exceeded the disappointment Richard had ever imagined. He began to realize that it was not just wealth that had corrupted his son, but that Dorian seemed to have completely lost the concept of familial love. Each passing day is a day Richard waits for change, a sign that Dorian will realize something. But all hope gradually faded as Dorian continued to live in a facade of luxury, selfishness, and indifference. These real-life experiences made Richard realize that it was time for him to take more decisive action. He cannot let Dorian continue to wallow in this depravity. Richard knew that the challenge had just begun, and he needed a real shock to awaken Dorian. After weeks of hiding and observing from afar, Richard could no longer bear the disappointment in his son. He decided to confront Dorian directly, hoping to awaken some remnants of familial affection in his son. It was a chilly evening. Richard stood in front of an upscale restaurant, the place Dorian frequently visited with friends and business associates. Richard walked into the restaurant, his shabby clothes and weary appearance immediately drawing disdainful looks from the staff and patrons. When he approached the reception desk, Richard politely requested a seat, but the server coldly refused with a look of disdain. "Sorry, sir. Our restaurant does not serve customers like you." Richard swallowed his embarrassment and turned to search for Dorian in the opulent space. Finally, he saw his son laughing and joking comfortably at the banquet table with his colleagues. Richard's heart tightened. He took a deep breath, stepped forward, and gently called out, "Dorian." Dorian looked up, his eyes momentarily surprised, but quickly turning cold and displeased. Looking at the man with the disheveled appearance in front of him, Dorian frowned and coldly asked, "Who are you?" "I don't know you." Richard was stunned, feeling as if a knife had been plunged into his heart. He tried to stay calm, his voice hoarse. "It's me, Richard, your father." But Dorian did not waver at all. His gaze remained sharp and emotionless. With an indifferent tone, he curtly replied, "I don't have time for this nonsense." Get lost. Those cold words shattered Richard's last hope. He stood frozen, his eyes blurred with bitterness. Dorian returned to the party, completely indifferent to his father's presence. With no hope left, Richard quietly left the restaurant, carrying the profound pain of his son's indifference. The mounting disappointment had exceeded Richard's limit of endurance. He realized that Dorian was not only indifferent, but also completely alien to moral values and family feelings. Unable to let his son continue living in the illusion of power and wealth, Richard decided to take an unprecedented, harsh measure. He called Marcus, his longtime, loyal lawyer. In a cold and decisive tone, Richard ordered, "Significantly reduce Dorian's inheritance. Leave enough for him to live, but not enough to continue enjoying. It has to make everything on its own from here." Marcus was stunned by this decision. He hesitated and asked again, "Are you sure?" "This is an unprecedented decision." Richard coldly replied, "I have never been more certain than I am now. If I don't do it, Dorian will never learn any lesson." Not stopping there, Richard hired a private investigator named Olivia to delve deeper into Dorian's activities. The results caused him even more pain. Dorian had been involved in shady business deals, deceiving partners, and betraying those who once trusted him. Not only was he heartless, but Dorian also lost his morality and honesty. No longer able to delay, Richard decided to meet Dorian directly one last time to end everything. He sent someone to summon Dorian to the villa. When Dorian appeared, his usual confident demeanor had vanished, replaced by anxiety and restlessness. Richard was already seated at the large dining table, his face cold and his gaze sharp. He pointed to the chair opposite. "Sit down." Dorian reluctantly sat down, trying to stay calm. Richard did not beat around the bush. He spoke frankly. "You have betrayed everything we taught you. I have given you everything, but you only know how to indulge and destroy. You not only disappoint me, but you also betray the values of this family." Dorian replied angrily, "I made my own success. You can't deny that." Richard shook his head, his voice slow but full of authority. "No, Dorian. You have not created anything on your own. You only know how to spend what we have created. From now on, I will not let you continue like this anymore." He pushed a file folder towards Dorian. Inside were legal documents confirming the complete severance of Dorian's inheritance rights. Reading to the last lines, Dorian's face turned pale, his hands trembling. He roared, "You can't do this to me." Richard replied calmly, his voice deep but firm, "I have done it. This is the last lesson I will teach you. From now on, you must stand up on your own 2 feet." Dorian stood up angrily, his eyes filled with rage. "I will never come back to this place again." He left in a fit of rage, leaving Richard sitting silently. His heart ached, but he knew that this was the right decision. Richard understood that only this strictness could awaken Dorian, if there was still a chance. But deep down, Richard couldn't help but wonder, will Dorian change, or will he remain lost forever? After Richard severed all inheritance rights, Dorian fell into a state of shock and anger. From a man who was always proud of his status, he now had to face the harsh reality. No more wealth, no more power, and no more support from his father. Immediately, the relationships that once surrounded Dorian began to fracture. Business partners, those who once flattered and praised him, are now gradually withdrawing upon realizing that he no longer has financial power. The investment projects he once confidently pursued continuously failed. Lacking a solid foundation and support from Richard, Dorian did not have the strength to salvage the situation. The friends who once stood by him at lavish parties and elegant gatherings have now turned their backs. Dorian gradually realized that those who once called him friends were actually only because of his wealth and status. His arrogance and selfishness had long pushed away genuine relationships. No longer having the financial means to maintain his lavish lifestyle, Dorian was forced to sell his last assets, from the expensive sports car to the luxury apartment. The more he tried to cling to what was lost, the deeper he sank into despair. For the first time in his life, Dorian had to face the direct consequences of his own arrogance and irresponsibility. A torrential rain night, Dorian wandered aimlessly through the streets, his mind in chaos. The once shiny leather shoes were now soaked, the luxurious suit was now wrinkled and drenched. Finally, he stopped in front of the cold iron gate of the villa, the house that was once a symbol of wealth and power, and also the place where his father's countless hopes were stored. But now, the mansion is silent, dark, and eerily cold. No more warm lights, no more the figure of the father who always watched over him. Dorian stood there, his hand resting lightly on the gate, his heavy eyes staring into the void. In that moment, he felt the loneliness and emptiness enveloping him. The cold rain pierced like daggers into his heart, but it couldn't compare to the regret gnawing at his mind. Dorian recalled the moments when Richard silently watched over him, the advice he had once ignored, the lessons on honesty and responsibility he had once taken lightly. Now he understands that true value does not lie in money or power, but in love, gratitude, and the moral values his father had always tried to impart. Loneliness and loss had awakened Dorian from his long slumber. He realized that he could not continue living in the past, clinging to what was lost. If he wants to change, he must start over from the beginning, with his own strength and effort. Dorian decided to leave the city, abandoning the remnants of his former luxurious life. He sought small jobs, starting from the lowest positions in companies he had once looked down upon. From working as a low-level employee, a waiter, to manual labor jobs, Dorian gradually learned humility and came to appreciate the value of honest labor. The hard days were not easy, but as each day passed, Dorian felt a clear sense of maturity in his thoughts and actions. He began to rebuild sincere relationships, not based on money, but on genuine honesty and kindness. Dorian also took time to reflect on the lessons from his father. He reread the business books Richard had given him, pondering over each piece of advice he had previously ignored. Now, those things have become a guiding compass for the new path he is embarking on. Dorian knows that the journey ahead will be extremely difficult, but he is ready to face the challenge. Without his father by his side to support him, he had to stand up and start over on his own. That is not only the path for him to regain success, but also a journey to rediscover his true self, a person who knows how to live responsibly, ethically, and cherish family bonds. On that journey, Dorian carried a steadfast belief that if he was persistent and sincere enough, there would come a day when he could return, face the father he had once hurt, and prove that he had changed. The story of Richard Kensington and his son Dorian is not only a family tragedy, but also a profound lesson about human values and what truly matters in life. This is a clear testament to the power of will, perseverance, and irreplaceable moral values. Although Richard possessed immense wealth and overwhelming power, he could not buy the respect, gratitude, and love from his only son. That is what forced him to undertake a harsh challenge to awaken Dorian from the illusion of power and wealth. Material wealth can bring power and convenience, but it can never replace love, honesty, and responsibility. Dorian had to pay a heavy price for his pride and selfishness, but it was through those losses that he truly understood the true value of life. Dorian's awakening is proof that people can make mistakes, but there is always a chance to correct them if they are willing to reflect on themselves and persist in changing. The profound message that the story conveys is, never judge a person's worth by their wealth or status. Wealth only truly matters when accompanied by gratitude, ethics, and responsibility. A person can possess all the material wealth in the world, but if they lose their moral values, they will become empty and lonely. Have you ever sacrificed something for money? Are you letting material ambitions overshadow the core values in life? Don't let wealth make us forget our loved ones, genuine values, and gratitude for the good things life brings. Wealth may be lost, but kindness and morality will last forever. Live with responsibility, gratitude, and always strive tirelessly to be worthy of what we have. True happiness does not come from luxury, but from sincere feelings, from appreciating one's own efforts and those of the people who have always accompanied us. In the end, the story reminds each of us that true wealth does not lie in the possessions we hold, but in a kind heart and an indomitable will in the face of challenges.